Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my course on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John Dee. Today we are going to go through Theorem 9, and it will be our first iteration of Theorem 10. This is Dee's great Big Bang, where we get the birth of the tree of life. Now, I put a link below explaining why I am sure that Dee in 1564 has this conception of the tree of life. I've also been working on this text since before 2007, so bear with me. I've done the work so you don't have to. As before, I'm using the translation that I did with Dr. Nancy Turner that came out from Ouroboros Press in 2021. So let's go on and look at Theorem 9. As you've heard me say before, now, please see the earlier videos. There's a link to the whole playlist below. We've gone all the way through the first 8 theorems and the whole letter to Maximillian, the letter to the printer, discuss context in the light of cosmogenic text. Cosmogenesis means the creation of the cosmos or universe. So basically, please watch those videos first. This, looking at Theorem 9 and 10, these two theorems are a kind of great punctuation of what comes before. So it's like, don't watch the high point of a series without watching everything that leads up to it. Okay, he's taking apart the symbol and putting it back together. As you well know, he's been manipulating it around in all kinds of different ways. I also want to just remind you that this symbol, which Dee has here, is his symbol of the sun, and it will also become a symbol of many other things. But to a Pythagorean, this is the monad symbol, not all the rest of this. Dee's stylized glyph of Mercury is also his monad, but to a Pythagorean, it's just this. That's going to be real important in understanding this theory. So what I want to do before jumping into 9 is review Dee's cosmogenesis so far. We open up in theorems 1 through 5. Explicitly, Dee is merging Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis 1 through 5, with the master craftsman from Plato's Timaeus. One earlier theorem, I even gave you the homework of reading Plato's Timaeus or a summary of it, because it's very, very important to understanding the hieroglyphic monad. But you know the beginning, perhaps, of Genesis. Most people in Western cultures do, whether they're Christian or not. Let there be light, or as you would say in the Latin Vulgate, fiat lux. They write it LVX instead of LUX because of the way things are written at that time. Later on, this will become a very important symbol in Theorem 17. Today, it is the symbol of the signs of the adept in many initiatory groups. Okay, I've also talked about how in Euclidean geometry, and Dee is an expert in ancient Greek geometry. He wrote an introduction to the translation of the first English translation of Euclid's geometry done by Billingsley after the monad was out. But you need the tools of a compass and straight edge. There is, along with utilitarian significance for those, there's a lot of metaphysical significance for a compass and straight edge. Anyway, if you draw a circle, it is always something that can flip into the most perfect shape, a sphere, just like a line can flip into a two-dimensional plane, although Dee will sometimes use the word for line to indicate a line segment or a ray. That is something that goes from a point just infinitely into another direction. So what can we say about this V shape in LVX now that we are looking at letters themselves in terms of shapes, as we did in Theorem 8, which was the last one I talked about? Think about that for a minute before I just give you the answer. You saw what he did with X, or the Greek letter chi, which looks the same as an X. What would we have with a V? It can be the top part of a cube, but it can also be that cone that we talked about with the letter X. So basically what you have here is the kind of top part of creation, or in terms of the Timaeus, the world that is still of perfect forms, where nothing is in motion until that first flash of light manifests into the world of becoming. Remember, we talked in Theorem 6 about the notion of a quaternary and ternary. Those are also going to be important and He continued to talk about them in Theorems 7 and 8. There are three that remind us referred to many things: Father, Son, Holy Ghost, but not only that. 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the Quaternary, he referred to a tetractys. We also saw how Dee is always manipulating shapes and requiring your active visualization. So when he talks about this rectilinear cross, he wants you to drop the point out and make it a quaternary, just as when it was 1, 2 lines and an intersecting point, it was the ternary. That was another of his references for ternary. So then he wants you to take with this cross those right angles and flip them out so you have a square. Then you flip the square into a cube. Then now that he does in 6, because here's a cube flipped out as a cross. But also when you make a cube, then you have 8 vertices. And you can also inscribe another form, an octahedron, into a cube. So I'm just reminding you that he's not always just having this rigid form. You have to take it apart and put it back together. I also want to remind you of some of the links that he makes with Timaeus. The character Timaeus in Plato's Timaeus links each of the Empedoclean elements, water, air, earth, and fire, to a platonic solid: earth to a cube, air to an octahedron, water to an icosahedron, fire, which will be very important in Theorems 9 and 10, to a tetrahedron. And these three can turn into each other, but they turn into each other paradoxically in a perfect eternal world of perfect forms. That's the world of being. We in Plato's Timaeus are in the world of becoming, where everything is in motion and you can't always tell what a shape is, what element it's made of. And by the way, if you saw one was missing, yes, the sphere is the perfect shape, and ether is associated with the dodecahedron, which is partly because it is most shaped like a sphere, the perfect form, we're told. But again, this is all perfect forms. And if you're still correlating this to Genesis, as Dee would be doing, we're just on the second day of creation by now. We're on to Genesis 6 to 7. And then in 7, we get magical flux, which I talked about in that class. 7 days of creation, time and space as related to measures. 7 is related to flux. We get the 7 planets. Again, see earlier videos, but then you get an example of how Dee's math is maybe not your math or my math. We realize in Theorem 8 that the letter X can represent those kissing cones I showed you, but also 7 plus 3, 7 times 3, Christ, a cone. Dee loves associative thought. So if you love associative thought, you will, I think, see the universe created from it here shortly. And we're going to finally get to our third cosmogenic representation of the tree of life at the end of Theorem 10. So now let's look at 9. I'm just going to read through it as I've done before, and I'm just going to read through the beginning here. Dee says, one will also see that this coincides very well with the sun and moon of our monad, since through the magic of the same 4 elements, a most exact separation is made in their lines, and therefore by means of the circular motion of their lines. For according to the rules of geometry, the magnitude of any line permits a circle to be described. Circular motion of their lines describe a conjunction of the circle will be made in the solar complement. Okay. Stop there. I put this in bold because we might want to ask, what is this? Is this everything before? In a sense, it is. But most specifically, it is going to refer to the end of the last theorem, or the subject of the last theorem, I should say, which I'll quote again for you here. Dee has told us that the Kabbalistic expansion of the Quaternary, according to the customary phrasing of numbers, when we say 1, 2, 3, 4, produces in sum the denary. And then he gives a whole explanation of what he means by that, which we talked about in our last video. But even there, he's dropping in Kabbalistic expansion of the Quaternary. What does he mean? Well, he could mean the 4 worlds, except the world hasn't even been created yet. You see, if we're correlating this to Genesis, we're on day 2. When he says 1, 2, 3, and 4, he's often referring to another decad, the Pythagorean tetractys, which we have seen in a couple theorems, right? So every side adds up to 10. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 equals 10. And there's 10 dots, and the top is of the decad is a higher order monad. All right, could be that. Something else. If you just look at the Roman numerals he uses, he's writing V 1, 2, 3, 4. Rather than the way we would write it. Now that's partly just the time he's in, but there are people that are writing it this way. It's, in other words, it's not 1 less than 10. We're still accreting things, and the world has not yet formed. All right. So we have talked about the cone, but let's look up here, the sun and the moon of our monad. Here's the sun and here's the moon. We've talked about how they refer to the emerald tablet, right? And we have talked about how this is the center part down here of a vesica piscis, which is a lens for light, of course. So in the emerald tablet, the sun and the moon create the one thing, the monad. So you are seeing this lens of light creating something here, a lens for the divine light of creation. Now it starts getting close to that big bang of creation. Remember again, the sun symbol to the Pythagoreans is the whole monad, but it's also, among other things, father, son of the emerald tablet, like I just mentioned to you. And this point right here in the center is the one that is punctured by Mercury or Stilbon or a stylus or all these many associations. See the link below to the What is Mercury video. It's going to give birth to all things. But we have also seen how the displaced point of the ternary, now look here again, remember the ternary, when Dee introduced that, he said 1, 2, and the dot in the middle is 3. So you displace that dot of the ternary and you get the quaternary, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. And through this little dot, all of the Platonic forms are birthed via the Pythagorean cosmogenesis of the Timaeus and those ideas. So this displaced point becomes that point. In effect, this, what will become the cross of the elements, also is superimposed over the sun. In ways it supports the sun too. But through this point here, or this one superimposed, light infuses and creates the cosmos. Now, there's some cool things you can do that we'll get to with this, the cross of the element superimposed over the sun. But right now, I just want to bring your attention to a translation point, circular motion. Sometimes this is translated in a confusing way as circumference. Dee goes out of his way in Latin to use an unusual Latin word. He could have just said circumference if he meant circumference. Instead, he Latinizes the ancient Greek word that can mean periphery, periphora, but it means a circular motion. So we're getting the idea of a revolving circle or a revolving sphere. Now, what do you remember? This is important. Once you have motion, where are you? You're in the world of becoming. So all these forms have come through this point. We're not in the eternal, unchanging world of being, of perfect form. We're in the world of motion, the world where there's flux, the world where you can't step into the same river twice. So that's linking us to Timaeus, the world of becoming, and not the perfect forms in the world of being. This comment, by the way, for this word in parentheses, for according to the rules of geometry, the magnitude of any line permits a circle to be described. That's just a basic definition from Euclidean geometry. The magnitude of a line describes the diameter of a circle. But what I want to figure out here with you is, what circle is he talking about? This circle, the Pythagorean monad, that's the whole cosmos. That's the world, though, of perfect, well, it's the perfect cosmos. The one in motion has just started. So how many circles do we suddenly have? We've seen in earlier videos some drawings of the Platonic perfect forms in spheres, because those are the perfect forms, and you can inscribe a tetrahedron or a cube or a dodecahedron, any of the 5 Platonic forms in a sphere. But now everything's revolving. Creation has started. It is blasted out. It has punctured this perfect sphere. So what is going to happen now? Well, let's see. He talks about the solar complement, and the conjunction of the circle will be made in the solar complement. Let me explain this a little bit, and then I will tell you what has happened. First, notice that he has drawn attention to that by doing it in caps, small caps, and then putting a space between every letter. So something is important about the sun. The word he uses in Latin is solare. It means both pertaining to the sun. It can also mean sundials. So we're now in the world where time has started. Remember, spatial measures in the perfect world correspond imperfectly to temporal measures, like 360 degrees in a circle, 365 days in a year, and so on. Lots of measures of 12 that are in both sevens that have to do with time, 7 days in a week, the 7 classical planets rotating. You don't get any measure of 7, not with faces, not with vertices, not with anything in the regular Platonic solids. Okay, so it's also solare, can mean console. So there's this idea that when the upper line of this glyph that represents the moon is conjunct with the sun, which is what happens when the sun and moon of the Emerald Tablet give birth to the one thing, which is the alchemical great work in one sense and the creation of the cosmos in another, it consoles the sun upon which it depends. Why? Because the moon's light is actually the sun's light. It's reflecting the light of the sun. All light enters through this point in the center of the solar complement. Okay, then we're going to get to his final line. So one cannot fail to see how well the proportion of the denarii of the cross serves the sun and moon. You got that, right? That makes perfect sense, right? If that made perfect sense to you, you're a genius, and I want to take lessons from you. Because even if you've been following along, most people would say, what? How does that in any way sum up what he said before? Where do we have the proportion of the denarii? The denarian, or proportion of 10 that we've had so far, has been referred to this perfect Pythagorean form, the tetractys, that according to Ian Blakiston, that like Pythagoreans would swear an oath on it. Fine, but now we're going to have the denarii of the cross, and this is the cross anyway. How is there 10 there? Where is the proportion of the denarii of the cross? Well, this cross below, as we've discussed in 4 theorems, these, if you make them part of a sphere and thus superimpose spherical and what we would now call Cartesian geometry, you get 4 circles. All right. Well, if this is up here, maybe you'd have 8 circles. But it doesn't seem to make sense. So let's just say it doesn't make sense and go to theorem 10 and see if that will help us make some sense out of it. Now, I'm going to have another whole video on theorem 10 and applying theorem 10 back to all the first 10 theorems, okay? So there's a lot that I'm skipping over here, but I just want to speak to this point of how the proportion of the denarii of the cross serves the sun and moon. We know the cross, as I said, appears to be supporting the sun and moon. So in that sense, if it supports it, it serves it, but where are the 10? All right. So theorem 10, oh, here's that X, the intersecting cones, the flash of light. And then we get this, the sign of the dodecatamorian of Aries. What is a dodecatamorian? Well, now for astrologers out there, you know that if you look up at the celestial sphere and you divide it into the zodiac, you divide it into 12 signs, but each of those signs can be divided up in terms of decads, in terms of 10. There's another measure, though, where you divide them up into dodecatemorians. And if I'm mispronouncing that word, I apologize, because I've only read it and I don't know anyone who knows how to pronounce it, because it doesn't appear very often. You divide it into 12. So by that, in the first sign, Aries, that's where the year started then, beginning of the spring equinox. I mean, now we think it's January 1st, but in Dees time, the year starts in the spring equinox, Aries. So the beginning of Aries is Aries of Aries, the first 1/12 of that sign, which is 1/12 of the circle that represents the heavenly sphere. Are you with me? Now, Aries is cardinal fire. Today, as in Dees time, the zodiac, and we know, by the way, we're in the world of becoming because we're doing time measures. Everything is in motion. So in Dees time, like today, you have signs divided up by elements and by whether they are cardinal, fixed, or mutable. So Aries is cardinal, initiating fire. The first 12th of Aries, Aries of Aries, is initiatory fire, in effect. So then Dee will continue and say it's very well known to everyone, maybe well known to the people Dee hangs out with, but not to most people I know. That's why I've just explained it. It has, according to the custom of astronomers, this somewhat sharp-edged and pointy form. That's his symbol of Aries, which is down here at the bottom of the monad. All right, and here you're getting this symbol thanks to my husband Alan Moore, the Enochian magician, not the British graphic novelist, though they both have nice beards. You get him labeling it as fire. It is well known that from this place in the heavens, the first 12th of the first sign of 12, 144th. Dee will also allude a lot to Revelation, by the way. 144, what's that in Revelation? It's well known that from this place in the heavens, the beginning of the fiery triplicity is designated. For this reason, we've added the astronomical sign of Aries right here, in order to signal that in monadic praxis, the ministry of fire is required. Not the use of fire, the ministry of fire. Fire is going to minister, help, be dedicated to whatever happens here. The service of fire. Thus, we have here briefly brought forth one hieroglyphic consideration of our monad in which we want to express a unique hieroglyphic construction as follows. The moon and sun of our monad, the sun and moon giving birth to the one thing, but yet there's also a sun and moon in the monad. So remember, he's shifting things around always. The sun and moon of our monad desire that their elements in which the denarian proportion will flourish be separated, and that this be done with the ministry of fire. Now, here is where many people go wrong with understanding this text. The best translation done until I think the one Dr. Turner and I did was by C.H. Jostin. He was an incredible scholar of physical alchemy. He uses the language of physical alchemy. So there would be the idea that this must be, oh, fire. This is the alchemy of creating gold out of lead or something like that. And further, as I've mentioned often in these videos, the idea that Dee can't possibly know the tree of life or the Sefer Yetzirah, which is a bogus idea. So let me go through and show you what's happening here, because this is brilliant. This is one of the coolest transformations in the whole monad. We've talked about how this is Aries of Aries, 1/12 of a 12th of a flash of initiatory fire. That's what we might call today the Big Bang. It's also the creation from this point in the Pythagorean cosmogenesis of the whole universe. It punctures this point. That's another allusion to Mercury or Stilbon, or this sharp puncturing point that he's also equating to Aries. So fire, this 1/12 of a twelfth is puncturing this. Now, fire is needed for physical alchemy, as I've already mentioned, but we are still in the world of perfect forms, or, well, not actually, because things started moving in 9, didn't they? So we have a formation starting of the world that is the physical cosmos we live in now. But if we're in the world of becoming, we need to separate it out. Well, why would that be? If you read the Timaeus, you know that it's very hard to know if you're in the world of becoming what is what. You don't know if this is earth, if it's air, it's a mixture. And if it's a mixture, how do you separate them? How do you know if your separation is right? How do you even know what a shape is? Because everything is kind of a mess, and you have the gods and goddesses of the planets and other gods in that theogony sort of helping by reason for you to put some order on this chaos. Sacred geometry is sacred because by contemplating these perfect forms, you start to separate out. But that's after you're already here. Are we there yet? We almost are. Flip the monad over. Now what do you have? Fire is at the top. Why would we want fire at the top? Because this is the flash of that separates things out into 10 Sephiroth, 10 emanations of God in Kabbalistic thought. So what Dee is doing is taking something that, from a perspective like Dee's, is relatively new. That is, the study of Kabbalah is not a couple thousand years old. It's a few hundred years old in Dee's time. So Kabbalah is a newer way of looking at it than ancient Greek geometry, not the reverse. So you have what we now think of as the lightning flash down the tree, or as he has represented it in his letter to Maximillian, a flaming sword down this middle part, which is the middle pillar. And he is using the associations that already existed in his time, and which I am certain he already knew. So you have the flash down the tree, there's fire, there's 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's the sun. The sun is associated with Tiferet. There's the moon associated with Yesod. Well, what do we do about these 4? Remember that these are superimposed over each other also. So you also have the lower 4. In effect, in Theorem 10, you have the creation of the tree of life, and you are now totally in the world of becoming. Except that, of course, you, in reading the monad, have been in the world of becoming all this time. So now what you have to do is go through all of the first theorems again, and then you, in effect, in your mind, as a contemplation of a perfect form, recreate the tree. I think that is pretty awesome. When I realized that in translating this, I had goosebumps all over my body. Too much information, right? Now, I have another video below saying more about how we know that Dee could have known this tree. People now often call it the Kircher Tree, after a guy that lived, wrote 90 years after Dee. But Dee, I believe, had access to this, the Porta Lucis, which is by Joseph Gicatilla. It was a actually, he, I think, had access to the translation that was by Paulus Ricius, or sometimes called Paulo Ricio, and I talk about that more in another video. But this is Dee's direct line to Rabbinic Kabbalah, as it is absorbed into Christian Kabbalah via Ricio, via Johann Reuchlin. Now, if you haven't watched my video below and you are a scholar of Christian Kabbalah, you might say at this point, well, Reuchlin in his Art of Kabbalah didn't have any diagrams. No, but he advised on that one in the picture I just showed you. And if you say, well, Dee didn't have that book of Reuchlin in his library, no, but he had others. And people tend to look at works that they that they don't have in their library. And 2 years before this, Dee wrote a compendious table of Hebrew Kabbalah and was out collecting Hebrew grammars. Since I doubt that Dee read Hebrew very well, probably one of them he looked at was the one by Riccio, who also wrote in Latin a Hebrew grammar. Riccio was a Jewish converso. He converted to Christianity, and he was in the time of Maximillian the First. Dee is, of course, writing the monad to Maximillian II. So what we have here is the creation of the tree of life in the hieroglyphic monad. What we can do now is go back to all of the first 10 theorems and refer each of them to the Sephirah, look at what the qualities of the different Sephirah are in the tree of life, and that is what we will do next time. Thanks for joining me today. Have a great rest of your weekend, or whatever day of the week it is when you watch this. Bye-bye.